welted pockets can be used in anything from a men's suit jacket to a pair of trouser pants to a pocket in a handbag. You can use fabric that is similar to the main piece, something that is contrasting. You could do something on the bias to show off a check or a plaid. And the inside, you want it to be a nice stable fabric that won't easily be torn. This is the piece of fabric that I'm going to be putting my pocket into. This is going to be the lining of a leather bag that I'm making. This is my pocket. My pocket is cut 1 inch wider than my finished pocket. So for this example, this piece of fabric is 8 inches wide and my pocket is going to finish at 7 inches wide. So we have a 1/2 inch seam allowance on either side. I have cut one long pocket because I don't want a seam in the bottom. However, you can put a seam in the bottom, especially if you're working with a minimal amount of fabric. And the third piece of fabric that we need is our welt. And this piece of fabric I've cut 2 inches wide. I think this is about 11 inches long. So I cut it pretty long, but that's okay, I can trim it later. I have applied some fusible interfacing to the back. I've used black. You can use white, whatever color really suits the fabric that you're working with. And this just helps give it a little bit of body, and it'll help it to stand up when we're done. So first thing, I'm going to iron this piece of fabric in half lengthwise with the wrong sides touching. Next thing I want you to do is we're going to baste this together so that when we're sewing this to our main piece of fabric, it won't slip. Use a really long stitch length and use a shallower seam allowance than you'll be using later. For this, I'm using a 1/4 inch. No need to backstitch. So I'm just marking the beginning and stop points of my zipper. So here's my fabric welt, and next I'm going to put my pocket face down. And I'm going to line up my pocket so that I have seam allowance extending over the left and right ends of my pocket. Now I'm going to pin through all my layers. I'm going to draw really lightly in pencil where I need to stop sewing. Okay, now we're ready to sew. I have predetermined that my seam allowance is going to be a 1/2 inch from the cut edge of my fabric. And remember, we're going to start right on our pencil line. I'm going to stop on my other pencil mark and then do a back stitch. I think we can do one more. There we go. Now back stitch. Okay, now we're ready to pin the other side. Now we're ready to pin the top edge of our pocket. First of all, though, I'm going to trim down this seam allowance so that it doesn't get in the way for my second piece. I'm trimming this down to about a 1/4 inch. Okay, so now what we're going to do is, if you're using one piece of pocket fabric, you are going to pull it over first and then tuck your end back into itself. Now, kind of comes the tricky part. I want you to line up this cut edge of your pocket to the stitch line that we just created. This is when it's easier to use 2 pieces of fabric for your pocket, so you don't have this barrel that I've just created. If you had 2 pieces, this could split right here and fold open. and then you can just sew it closed later. Okay, so I've made a few marks on my pocket that you can see. I've drawn in just little dashes for my 1/2 inch seam allowance, just because the second side of this pocket is typically a little more difficult than the first side. I've also drawn in my start point and my stop point, so that I know I'm stopping and starting exactly where I did the first time. Alright, now we're done sewing. On the back, the wrong side of your main piece of fabric, you should see your 2 parallel lines of sewing. And they should end at pretty much the same spot, left and right. If you're off like a stitch or two, just go back and fix it real quick. It won't take you very long. Now we're going to open our pocket. I like to use, these are my favorite scissors because they have a really sharp point and then a blunt end. I'm going to put my hand on the inside of my pocket, my left hand, because I use scissors with my right. And we're going to start in the middle of our pocket and cut it open. Make a triangular cut 3/8 of an inch down from where you stop sewing. Take your time with this. I'm using silk so it kind of frays easily. I suggest you try this with a really nice cotton just until you've practiced. Okay, so what I've done is I've split my pocket right between those 2 parallel lines of sewing, and then I gave myself 2 triangular sections. One I made a little longer than the other. It doesn't really matter. I think between 3/8 and 5/8 you should be fine. Now we're going to pull our pocket through. So here's our welt. Just push the ends of your welt into the space that you just created by cutting those little triangles. And they should want to stay on the inside there. Okay, so now we're going to do a little bit of ironing. Pressing all of our seam allowances nice and flat. This seam allowance for this part, I think both of them should go up towards the top, and these seam allowances all want to go down to the bottom. And this space right here is where our triangular sections that we cut earlier are. And I just press this a little bit, use a little bit of steam. Steam always makes everything better. Alright, so our next 2 steps, we're going to top stitch really close to this folded edge, only between the top and bottom edges of our pocket. That's going to stabilize the corners and also keep our triangular sections from flopping back into our pocket. I'm going to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge of that triangular piece. Okay, so I just sewed a top stitch at this edge and at this edge of my pocket so that it doesn't come undone. It looks pretty good so far. Alright, our last step is to actually sew the pocket bag closed. I'm going to use a 1/2 inch. Just make sure you don't sew through your outer fabric, but try and get as close to this edge of your pocket welt as you can. Okay, we're done. Now we have a nice welted pocket.